Why do the oldest records of civilization begin in the middle of the story, not with fire discovered or language slowly forming, but with cities already standing, laws already written, and the sky already measured? In the Sumerian tablets, there is no dawn, only daylight, as if something important happened before anyone thought to remember it. That absence feels less like coincidence, and more like loss, or concealment, or quiet forgetting. Tonight, we will move slowly through that silence together, listening not to what history says, but to what it avoids. If you find comfort in questions that do not demand answers, you're in the right place. Welcome to this long journey with historic sleep. And before you drift too far, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if you truly enjoy what I'm doing here. I'd also love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there now. Because some histories are not meant to wake us, they are meant to linger, like footprints beneath drifting sand, waiting for someone quiet enough to notice. The first thing that unsettles careful readers of Sumerian records is not what they contain, but what they do not bother to explain. There is no gradual awakening, no clumsy experimentation with symbols, no hesitant steps towards social order. Instead, the earliest tablets speak with the confidence of a culture that already knows who it is. Kings rule, temples function, laws exist, time is measured, the world is organized. Civilization, in these records, does not begin. It simply arrives. The Sumerian king list opens with a phrase that has disturbed historians for generations. Kingship descended from heaven. It is presented without metaphor, without justification, without curiosity. The list then proceeds to name rulers whose reigns stretch impossibly long, tens of thousands of years, before suddenly compressing into timelines that resemble something more familiar. What matters is not whether those early reigns were symbolic or literal. What matters is that the scribes never pause to clarify. They assume a shared understanding that no longer exists. This pattern repeats across Sumerian literature. Administrative texts, legal codes, hymns, astronomical observations, all appear fully formed. Writing is already standardized. Mathematics already operates on a base 60 system, sophisticated enough to divide time and space with enduring precision. Urban planning already follows ritual and cosmological principles. Even the relationship between humans and the divine is already defined, regulated, and contractual. There is no memory of a time before these systems worked. Archaeology reinforces the discomfort. When excavators reached the deepest layers of cities like Uruk or Eridu, they expected crude beginnings, simple huts, scattered tools, transitional debris. What they found instead were organized settlements, monumental architecture, and evidence of complex social coordination from the very start of occupation layers. Below them there is often nothing: sterile soil, flood deposits, abrupt breaks. Civilization seems to rest on silence. Mainstream explanations often lean on compression. The argument goes that development happened quickly, faster than expected, and the records simply didn't preserve earlier stages. But this explanation struggles to account for the uniformity. Independent innovations usually leave messy traces: competing systems, abandoned experiments, errors corrected over time. Sumerian civilization shows little of that. It behaves like an inheritance rather than an invention. Even their myths refuse to cooperate with a simple origin story. When the Sumerians tell of creation, they speak of ordering chaos, assigning roles, fixing boundaries. Humans are made not as explorers or discoverers, but as workers within an already structured cosmic system. The gods themselves operate councils, hierarchies, and administrative processes that mirror human institutions too closely to feel accidental. The world is not new. It is reorganized. Some scholars have suggested that the Sumerians did not see value in recording beginnings, that origins were sacred, ineffable, or assumed. But this explanation falters when placed beside other ancient cultures. Egyptian texts obsess over first times. Vedic hymns circle endlessly around primordial moments. Even later Mesopotamian traditions speculate about before and after. The Sumerians, by contrast, remain curiously uninterested. It is as if they stood at the edge of memory, looking backward into something too distant, too broken, or too dangerous to articulate. Instead of describing it, They codified what survived. They recorded functions, not foundations. They preserved roles, not origins. This absence has consequences. Without a recorded beginning, modern historians are forced to treat Sumer as a starting point, even when the evidence resists that framing. The temptation is to label it the first civilization, not because it explains itself as such, but because nothing earlier speaks clearly enough to challenge it. Silence becomes authority. Yet silence can also be protective. In many cultures, what is not written is not forgotten, but controlled. Knowledge can be restricted through omission, as effectively as through destruction. If the Sumerians inherited their systems from an earlier culture, one disrupted by catastrophe, migration, or collapse, then preserving continuity may have mattered more than preserving truth. To explain the break would be to acknowledge vulnerability. Flood narratives hover nearby. They do not describe the beginning of civilization, but the resetting of it. A world destroyed, a chosen survivor. Knowledge preserved through instruction rather than rediscovery. After the waters recede, life resumes, not from scratch, but from fragments carefully carried forward. This is not a myth of invention. It is a myth of salvage. In that light, the absence of origins begins to feel intentional, not deceptive, but resigned. A recognition that whatever came before could no longer be fully accessed. Better to begin recording once stability returned, once systems could be trusted again. Better to write from the moment the ground stopped shaking. Modern discomfort with this idea is understandable. History prefers continuity. Academia favours gradualism. The notion that civilization could appear suddenly because it is a remnant rather than a root destabilises comfortable timelines. It suggests that what we call the beginning might actually be a recovery phase. And so, the earliest Sumerian records stand like a shoreline after a storm. Buildings intact, tools arranged, society functioning. But behind them, the sea, no footprints leading up to the sand. No record of how anyone arrived there, only the sense that they came from somewhere else, carrying more than they could explain. What remains unresolved is not whether the Sumerians were brilliant. They clearly were. The deeper question is why they never felt compelled to tell us how that brilliance began, whether they could not remember, or whether they remembered too well. Because sometimes the most revealing chapter in history is the one that everyone agrees not to write. If the silence at the beginning of Sumerian history feels unsettling, the speed of what follows feels even more so. Civilization does not merely appear, it arrives already burdened with complexity. Writing is not tentative. Law is not experimental. Astronomy is not observational guesswork. Each system functions as if it has already survived a long period of correction, failure, and refinement. Yet none of that process is visible in the record. The earliest known Sumerian writing does not resemble a primitive attempt at communication. It is administrative, abstract, and highly structured. Symbols stand for sounds, ideas, quantities, professions, and goods. This is not the language of a people discovering writing for the first time. It is the language of a bureaucracy that already depends on it. Mistakes are rare. Conventions are consistent. The script behaves like a mature tool, not a recent experiment. The same pattern appears in law. Long before Hammurabi carved his code into stone, Sumerian cities already operated under legal principles that regulated property, labour, marriage, debt, and punishment. These laws assume precedent. They assume memory. They assume disputes have happened before, often enough to require standardised solutions. There is no surviving phase where justice is improvised or debated openly. It simply exists, already authoritative. Mathematics deepens the unease. The Sumerian base 60 system is not intuitive. It is elegant, flexible, and astonishingly durable, still embedded in how we measure time and angles today. Such a system is unlikely to be accidental. It requires abstraction, repetition, and long-term utility to justify its adoption. Yet no earlier numerical system survives to show how this one evolved. It arrives complete, as if chosen rather than discovered. Astronomy reinforces this impression. The Sumerians tracked planetary cycles, eclipses, and stellar movements with precision that implies sustained observation across generations. Calendars aligned with agricultural, ritual, and administrative needs. The sky was not merely watched, It was interpreted through a stable framework. This suggests inherited data, not a first glance upward. Knowledge accumulated somewhere before it was written down here. Architecture follows the same rhythm. Monumental construction appears early, demanding coordinated labour, standardized measurements, and shared symbolic meaning. Ziggurats were not functional necessities, they were statements of cosmology, authority, and permanence. To build them required not just engineering skill, but confidence that such structures belonged in the world. That confidence rarely emerges overnight. The common response is to compress time, to imagine centuries of rapid development hidden behind the earliest surviving layers. But compression cannot explain coherence. When innovation accelerates naturally, it leaves traces of chaos. Competing systems overlap. Old methods linger alongside new ones. Errors accumulate and are corrected. Sumer shows little of this turbulence. Its systems align too neatly, as if assembled from a shared blueprint. This has led some researchers to propose that Sumerian civilization represents not a birth, but a convergence. That multiple streams of older knowledge, technological, symbolic, astronomical, were gathered and formalized after a disruption. In this view, Sumer is less a spark and more a consolidation point, a place where fragments became stable enough to endure. The idea is uncomfortable because it reframes progress. It suggests that advancement may not always be linear, and that complexity can reappear after collapse without retracing every step. It also implies loss, that something capable of generating such systems existed earlier, but did not survive intact. Mythology hints at this possibility without stating it outright. The gods do not teach humans how to invent writing. They assign it. They do not debate laws. They decree them. Knowledge descends, fully formed, from a higher order. Whether this is metaphor, memory, or ideology remains uncertain, but the narrative choice is telling. The Sumerians imagined wisdom as something received, not discovered. Language itself resists easy explanation. Sumerian is a linguistic isolate. It has no known relatives. It does not fit neatly into surrounding language families. This isolation mirrors the cultural pattern. Just as the language appears without ancestors, so too does the civilization that speaks it. Both seem suspended in history, connected forward but not backward. Modern scholarship often treats these anomalies separately. Writing here, math there, architecture somewhere else. But taken together, they form a pattern too consistent to ignore. Each system behaves as if it remembers a longer past than the record allows, as if the hands using them had practiced before. What makes this especially unsettling is how familiar it feels. Even today, societies inherit technologies they no longer understand. We use tools whose origins are opaque, whose creators are anonymous, whose principles are taken on trust. The difference is that our documentation is abundant. The Sumerians left us function without foundation. Perhaps that foundation once existed and was lost. Perhaps it was never meant to be preserved. Or perhaps the act of preservation itself began only after something ended. In the aftermath of disruption, survival favours practicality. You record what works, you do not dwell on what failed. Seen this way, Sumerian complexity is not miraculous but mournful. It is the quiet order that follows disorder. The careful stacking of systems after the ground has settled. The decision to move forward without reopening old wounds. And yet the question remains unresolved. If this civilization inherited its sophistication, from whom did it inherit it? Where are the workshops of trial and error? Where are the half-finished ideas? Where are the discarded paths that usually litter the road to complexity? They are not in the tablets. They are not in the soil. They exist only as absence. And absence, when it persists this consistently, begins to feel less like chance and more like a boundary. A line drawn between what could be remembered and what could not be carried across whatever divide came before. The Sumerian records do not remember a beginning, but they remember an ending. This difference matters. Where modern histories search for origins, Sumerian texts circle around rupture. Their most persistent stories do not ask how the world was made, but how it was unmade, and what little was allowed to survive the unmaking. The flood is not a side myth. It is the gravitational centre around which memory bends. In these narratives, the flood is never treated as a surprise. It is announced, it is expected, it is negotiated. Ziusudra is warned not because he is clever, but because someone decides that something must continue. Instructions are precise. Measurements are given. Preservation is planned. This is not chaos remembered after the fact. It is catastrophe anticipated. The tone is administrative, almost procedural, as if the destruction of the world were an operation rather than an accident. What follows the flood is even more revealing. There is no confusion, no rediscovery of fire, no struggle to communicate. When the waters recede, the survivor does not wander into ignorance. He resumes a structure. Rituals continue. Offerings are made correctly. Language functions. Authority is recognized. Civilization reappears, with its internal logic intact. This is not how beginnings behave. Beginnings are messy. They hesitate, they contradict themselves. What the Sumerians describe instead is continuity across devastation. The world ends, but knowledge does not. At least not entirely. Archaeology offers a muted but persistent echo of this story. Beneath the earliest urban layers of southern Mesopotamia, excavators encounter thick bands of alluvial silt. These layers are not symbolic. They are physical records of overwhelming floods, capable of erasing settlements completely. In some locations, human occupation disappears for generations, only to return later with familiar organizational patterns but altered material expression. The ground records interruption, not evolution. The difficulty lies in scale. Floods are common in river civilizations. But the Sumerian flood is not local. It is total. It erases kings, cities, and lineages. It marks the end of an age. This suggests either exaggeration or memory compressed across centuries of repeated trauma. Multiple floods, multiple collapses, layered into one story because the difference between them no longer mattered. What mattered was the feeling that everything known could vanish. If that feeling shapes Sumerian consciousness, then their historical silence becomes more understandable. When the past is associated with annihilation, there is little incentive to romanticize it. Instead, attention turns forward. Stability becomes sacred. Preservation becomes moral duty. You record what must not be lost again. This may explain why Sumerian texts focus so heavily on function. How many workers? How much grain? Which ritual on which day? And which? The tablets are obsessed with maintenance. Civilization is something to be held together constantly, not celebrated as a triumph. The flood hovers behind every calculation, reminding scribes what happens when order fails. In this light, the gods take on a different role. They are not creators in the modern sense. They are managers of continuity. They regulate memory. They decide what knowledge passes through the rupture and what dissolves with the old world. Their power lies not in invention, but in selection. This idea appears again and again. The antediluvian kings reign impossibly long, as if time itself were different before the flood. Afterward, reigns shorten. Mortality tightens. History becomes measurable. The flood does not just destroy cities, it recalibrates reality. Before it, the world is vast and mythic. After it, the world becomes administrative. Modern scholars often treat these elements as symbolic, but symbolism does not explain consistency. Across generations of scribes, the same structure persists. Before the flood, abundance and excess. After the flood, regulation and restraint. This is not random myth-making. It reflects a worldview shaped by loss. The flood narrative also resolves a problem that origins cannot. If civilization appears suddenly and fully formed, that is troubling. But if civilization is restored after near total collapse, its sudden completeness makes sense. You are not seeing invention, you are seeing reconstruction. The tools work because they worked before. What remains invisible is the civilization that existed prior to the flood. Its cities are gone, its names are distorted, its technologies are folded into later systems without attribution. Sumer does not describe this world because it no longer exists as a coherent memory. It survives only as pressure, shaping what follows without revealing itself. This raises an uncomfortable possibility. That Sumerian civilization is not humanity's first attempt at order, but one of its successful recoveries. That earlier societies rose, developed complexity, and were erased so thoroughly that only fragments could be carried forward. The flood becomes the mechanism by which history forgets itself. Such an idea challenges the comfort of linear progress. It suggests that knowledge is fragile, and that catastrophe does not merely interrupt advancement, but can reset it while preserving just enough to begin again. In this framework, civilization is not a ladder, but a shoreline repeatedly reached after long periods underwater. The Sumerians seem to have lived with this awareness quietly. They did not dramatize the loss. They did not try to reconstruct what came before. They accepted the boundary. Their records begin where memory stabilizes, not where humanity awakens. And so the flood stands not only as a story of destruction, but as an explanation for silence. It answers why there is no beginning to describe, because the beginning belonged to a world that did not survive its own ending. What we inherit, then, is not the first chapter of human history, but the first chapter after forgetting. A civilization built carefully, anxiously, on ground that had already proven it could vanish. And beneath every tablet, every law, every measured hour of time, lies the quiet knowledge that this world too could end, leaving behind only fragments for someone else to resume. If the Sumerian records fall silent at the beginning, the ground beneath their cities echoes that silence in a different language. Archaeology, which is supposed to clarify origins, instead reinforces the sense of interruption. As excavators moved downward through the ruins of early Mesopotamian cities, they expected a gradual fading of complexity. What they found instead were sudden breaks, clean, unsettling pauses where human activity simply stops. In cities like Uruk, Eridu, and Lagash, the earliest occupational layers already reveal an organized urban life. Streets are aligned, buildings follow standardized proportions, religious spaces dominate the landscape in deliberate ways. These are not provisional arrangements. They are the result of shared assumptions about how a city should function. Yet beneath them, the evidence does not gently regress into simpler forms. It disappears. Often, the last human layer rests directly atop thick bands of alluvial silt. These deposits are unmistakable signs of massive flooding, events powerful enough to level structures, scatter materials, and rewrite the surface of the land. In some places, the silt is so uniform that it suggests prolonged inundation rather than a single seasonal overflow. Whatever existed before was not merely damaged, it was buried beyond easy recovery. What makes this disturbing is not the presence of floods. River civilizations expect them. What is disturbing is what comes after. When occupation resumes above these flood layers, it does not start hesitantly. The returning settlements are organized from the beginning. Social hierarchies reappear. Administrative practices resume. Symbolic architecture returns with confidence. Civilization does not relearn itself. It remembers. This pattern undermines the idea of a clean slate. If the land had truly been empty of human memory, we would expect disorder, improvisation, experimentation. Instead, we see continuity without context, as if the people who rebuilt already knew what a city was supposed to be, even if the previous city no longer existed. Environmental explanations account for destruction, but not for preservation of knowledge. Floods erase buildings and tools, but they do not selectively preserve social systems. Something else must be carrying that continuity. Not the ground, but people. Not material culture, but memory. One possibility is displacement rather than annihilation. Populations may have moved away from unstable floodplains during periods of environmental stress, carrying their traditions with them, only to return generations later when conditions stabilized. In this case, the archaeological gap reflects absence of settlement, not absence of civilization. The city disappears, but the culture does not. Yet even this explanation raises questions. Long absences usually introduce change. Styles shift, practices adapt, new influences enter. But early Sumerian culture shows remarkable internal coherence. Its systems fit together too smoothly to be the product of repeated reinvention. The knowledge feels curated, protected from erosion. This leads to a more uncomfortable thought, that the earliest Sumerian cities may not represent the first emergence of complexity in the region, but the first moment when complexity could remain visible. Earlier societies may have existed in landscapes now inaccessible, along river courses that have shifted, coastlines that have retreated, or lowlands that were later submerged or buried beneath meters of sediment. Modern remote sensing has revealed traces of ancient river networks beneath today's deserts. These paleochannels once carried water through regions now inhospitable, supporting vegetation, animals, and human settlement. If earlier civilizations clustered along these vanished waterways, their remains would be extraordinarily difficult to detect, but their disappearance would look like absence, not erasure. In this light, Sumer becomes less a birthplace and more a survivor, a civilization that arose at a moment when the environment stabilized long enough for memory to take physical form. Writing appears not because humans suddenly became clever, but because conditions finally allowed permanence. Clay could dry, cities could stand, records could endure. The Sumerians themselves seem to carry an awareness of this instability. Their myths speak of earlier ages that ended beneath water, of cities destroyed and rebuilt, of sacred places chosen long before the present order. These stories are often read as symbolic, but symbolism does not arise in a vacuum. It usually preserves emotional truth where factual detail has been lost. There is also the peculiar reverence for foundations. Temples are rebuilt again and again on the same footprints, even after destruction. The act of rebuilding is not relocation but return, as if the significance of place mattered more than the structures themselves, as if something beneath the visible city demanded continuity. This behaviour suggests inherited memory of loss. A culture that knows its cities can vanish learns to anchor meaning deeply. It learns to bind identity to coordinates, to layers beneath layers, to what cannot easily be washed away. Civilization becomes something that must be held in place against a hostile landscape. Archaeology, constrained by depth and practicality, often stops where excavation becomes dangerous or inconclusive. Decisions are made about how far down history is allowed to go. Below that, the past becomes speculative by necessity. But the repeated appearance of gaps beneath Sumerian cities suggests that those lower levels matter, even if they cannot be fully accessed. What we are left with is not proof of a lost civilization, but evidence of discontinuity, a rhythm of building, erasure, and return, and a pattern that mirrors the flood stories preserved in text. The ground and the tablets speak different languages, but they describe the same shape of time. The question that remains unresolved is scale. Were the missing layers home to small transient communities repeatedly washed away? Or do they represent something larger, more complex, now beyond recovery? Archaeology cannot answer this definitively. It can only point to absence where continuity should be. And so, the earliest Sumerian cities rise not from a visible foundation, but from silence. They stand atop land that has already forgotten what came before. In that forgetting, they build carefully, recording what they can, anchoring what matters, aware, perhaps more than we realize, that civilization is not born once, but repeatedly pulled back from the edge of disappearance. Beneath their streets and temples, the earth keeps its secrets intact, holding whatever stories could not survive the last time the world began again. The figures known as the Anunnaki occupy a strange position in Sumerian thought. They are everywhere, yet rarely explained. They appear already powerful, already ancient, already authoritative. They do not evolve, they do not learn, they do not emerge. They simply are. Modern readers often rush to label them gods, extraterrestrials, or metaphors, but these labels may obscure a more unsettling possibility: that the Anunnaki function as a memory system, preserving knowledge without revealing its source. In Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki are not creators in the sense of inventing civilization from nothing. They assign roles, they distribute domains, they establish laws and measurements. Their actions are administrative rather than creative. This distinction matters. Creation myths usually linger on struggle, improvisation, and emergence. The Anunnaki do none of this. They manage an order that already exists, as if their primary function is maintenance rather than genesis. This framing becomes more intriguing when we notice how closely their world mirrors human society. The gods convene councils, they debate policy, they assign labour, they punish violations of order. Their hierarchy resembles a bureaucratic structure more than a mystical one. It is almost as if the divine realm is a projection of a remembered system, elevated beyond time to protect it from loss. Seen this way, the Anunnaki may represent encoded continuity, not literal beings walking the earth, but symbolic carriers of inherited knowledge. By placing essential systems in the hands of immortal figures, the Sumerians ensured that those systems could not be questioned as recent inventions. Law, astronomy, kingship, and ritual did not come from fallible humans. They came from something older, wiser, and unchanging. This strategy solves a problem created by rupture. If civilization re-emerged after catastrophe, its builders would face a dilemma. How do you explain systems that work, but whose origins you no longer fully understand? How do you justify authority without a continuous lineage? The answer is to remove origins from human time altogether. You place them beyond history. The Anunnaki are never shown discovering knowledge. They possess it innately. This is not how myths usually behave when explaining invention. Instead, it resembles how societies treat inherited technology, whose development is forgotten. The tool is sacred, not because it is magical, but because it cannot be easily explained. Language reinforces this impression. The names of the Anunnaki are often tied to functions rather than personalities. They are associated with boundaries, judgment, fertility, order, and fate. These are abstractions, not characters. They map onto systems rather than stories. In this sense, the pantheon resembles a catalogue of principles, more than a family of beings. What is striking is how little narrative attention is paid to their origins. There is no genealogy that satisfies curiosity, no clear beginning. The Anunnaki are described as having existed before recorded time, before kingship, before the flood. This timelessness insulates them from historical scrutiny. You cannot investigate what has no beginning. This may not be accidental. In a culture shaped by loss, origins are dangerous. To trace something to a beginning is to admit it could end. By anchoring essential knowledge in timeless figures, the Sumerians created a buffer against forgetting. Even if cities fell and records were lost, the idea that order came from beyond human history could survive orally. Modern interpretations often strip these figures of their symbolic function. Some dismiss them as primitive attempts to explain natural forces. Others sensationalize them as misunderstood visitors. Both approaches miss the quieter possibility that the Anunnaki are neither naive nor literal, but mnemonic. They are a way of remembering without recording. Consider how the flood narrative intersects with them. The gods decide who survives. They preserve knowledge through instruction. They regulate what passes through the catastrophe. This is not the behavior of random deities, it is the behavior of curators. They act as filters, ensuring continuity across rupture. This interpretation also explains why the Anunnaki fade in later traditions. As memory stabilizes, as writing proliferates, as history extends forward without interruption, the need for symbolic guardians diminishes. Knowledge can be attributed to human ancestors again. Origins can be discussed cautiously. The gods retreat from administration into theology. But in early summer, that retreat has not yet happened. The Anunnaki remain close to the mechanics of civilization. They are invoked in contracts, they witness oaths, they enforce order, they function as guarantors of continuity in a world where continuity has already been broken once. There is a subtle melancholy in this arrangement. By elevating knowledge beyond human reach, the Sumerians may have been acknowledging a loss they could not repair. The true origins of their systems were no longer accessible. The gods become placeholders for a past that could not be fully recovered. This does not mean the Sumerians believed their gods were fictional. Belief and symbolism are not mutually exclusive. A symbol can be real in its effect even if its referent is abstract. The Anunnaki structured reality. They anchored meaning. They allowed civilization to function without reopening questions that could not be answered. What remains unresolved is what exactly was being remembered. Was it a prior civilization of comparable complexity? Was it accumulated knowledge from multiple cultures, compressed into one symbolic framework? Or was it simply the awareness that the present order was inherited rather than invented? The texts do not say. They do not need to. The Anunnaki do their work silently, standing between memory and oblivion. They ensure that what survives feels ancient, authoritative, and unquestionable. And perhaps that is their most important function. In a world rebuilt after loss, certainty becomes precious. The Anunnaki provide that certainty by removing the burden of explanation. They allow civilization to exist without origins, sustained by the belief that its foundations lie beyond the reach of time. In this way, the gods do not explain the beginning of civilization. They replace it, and in doing so, they preserve a silence that may be older, deeper, and more deliberate than any story we have left to read. If the ground beneath Sumer keeps its secrets through erasure, the sky above does so through consistency. This is where the puzzle deepens. The earlier Sumerian records treat the heavens not as a mystery to be solved, but as a system already mastered. The sky is measured, divided and synchronized with human life, in a way that suggests long familiarity rather than recent discovery. The celestial bodies in Sumerian texts are named, categorized, and tracked with calm assurance. The moon governs months, the sun anchors seasons. Planets follow predictable paths tied to omens, rituals, and administrative decisions. This is not the language of a culture experimenting with observation. It is the language of one maintaining a schedule. The heavens function like an inherited machine, whose workings are trusted because they have worked before. Astronomy requires patience. Cycles must be confirmed across decades. An eclipse pattern cannot be understood in a single lifetime without prior records. Yet when Sumerian astronomy enters history, it shows no uncertainty. There are no debates preserved, no discarded models, no visible struggle to reconcile conflicting observations. Agreement appears instantly, as if the knowledge arrived already settled. The mathematical framework supporting this knowledge reinforces the unease. The base 60 system is ideally suited for astronomical calculation. It allows for elegant division of circles, angles, and time. This is not an obvious system to invent casually. It reflects optimization, not experimentation. A choice refined through use, not stumbled upon by chance. What makes this more striking is how seamlessly astronomy integrates into every aspect of Sumerian life. Calendars regulate agriculture, taxation, festivals, and labour. Temples align rituals with celestial events. Kingship is justified through cosmic order. The sky is not abstract, it is operational. This level of integration implies that celestial knowledge predated the institutions built around it. The Sumerian gods associated with the heavens do not discover the stars. They govern them. The movements of planets are decrees, not observations. Once again, knowledge is framed as something assigned to humanity, rather than developed by it. The pattern repeats. Invention is absent. Transmission takes its place. This framing may reflect a practical truth, disguised as theology. If earlier societies had accumulated generations of astronomical observation, that knowledge could survive catastrophe more easily than material culture. Floods erase cities, but the sky remains. After disaster, the heavens would offer continuity when the earth could not. Knowledge of the stars would become a lifeline. Oral tradition could preserve such knowledge surprisingly well. Cycles can be encoded in myth. Alignments can be remembered through ritual. Calendars can be passed down without writing, as long as someone continues to watch the sky. Writing, then, would not create astronomy. It would capture it at the moment stability returned. This would explain why Sumerian astronomical texts feel so confident. They do not persuade or explain, they assert. The authority of the sky is unquestioned because it does not belong to human invention. It belongs to something older, something tested through loss. The architecture of Sumer supports this view. Ziggurats rise as artificial mountains, bridging earth and sky. Their alignments are precise. Their placement suggests calibration rather than curiosity. They are built to match celestial realities already known, not to discover them. Construction follows knowledge, not the other way around. There is also an emotional quality to how the sky is treated. It is stable where everything else is fragile. Rivers change course. Floods erase memory. Cities collapse. Dynasties vanish. But the stars return. Night after night, the same patterns endure. In a civilization shaped by rupture, this reliability would carry deep meaning. Modern assumptions often imagine early humans staring upward in wonder, slowly piecing together meaning. The Sumerian record suggests something quieter and more somber. The sky is not wondrous, it is dependable. It is consulted the way one consults an old authority, not a new curiosity. This suggests that Sumerian astronomy may not represent a beginning, but a recovery, a re-anchoring of civilization to something that survived when everything else failed. The sky becomes a scaffold on which order can be rebuilt. Time is measured again, seasons are trusted again. Rituals regain rhythm. If this is true, then the absence of astronomical development is not an oversight. It is a boundary. The learning happened before memory broke. What survives is the residue, already refined, already integrated. This interpretation also explains the global recurrence of ancient sky knowledge. Many early civilizations show advanced astronomical understanding without clear developmental trails. Rather than independent miracles, these may be echoes of shared survival strategies. When the Earth becomes unreliable, the sky becomes the archive. What remains unresolved is how deep this continuity runs. How many generations observed the same cycles before Sumerian scribes pressed them into clay? How many corrections were made, forgotten, and made again? How much knowledge was lost entirely, leaving behind only what could be remembered without tools? The tablets do not say. They begin after uncertainty ends, after the sky has been mapped enough times to be trusted again. The moment writing appears, the work of understanding has already been done. This forces an uncomfortable rethinking of what we call ancient. Sumerian astronomy is old, but it behaves as if it is older than Sumer itself. It carries weight without explanation. It assumes a past it does not describe. Once again, we encounter the same pattern. Systems too complete for their supposed beginnings. Knowledge without visible apprenticeship. Precision without recorded failure. The stars above Mesopotamia move silently through the centuries, indifferent to human forgetting. They witnessed floods, collapses, and returns. They were there before cities rose, and they remained after cities fell. Perhaps that is why the Sumerians trusted them so deeply. In a world that had already ended once, the sky became the one thing that did not need to be rediscovered. It simply waited. And when civilization returned to the surface of history, it looked up, recognized familiar patterns, and continued, not as if beginning, but as if resuming something it had known before the ground gave way beneath its feet. Language is often the most honest witness of time. It records accidents, borrowings, mistakes, and compromises. Even when history is lost, language usually remembers. That is why Sumerian unsettles scholars more than most ancient tongues. It does not remember its own beginning. It stands complete, disciplined, and isolated, as if it stepped into history already formed. Sumerian has no confirmed linguistic relatives. No ancestral language has been identified. No daughter languages clearly descend from it. This alone would be unusual, but the deeper unease lies in its maturity. The earliest written Sumerian is not crude or exploratory. It is capable of expressing law, ritual, commerce, philosophy, and poetry with remarkable precision. This is not what a newborn language looks like. Languages normally reveal their youth through instability. Meanings drift. Grammar fluctuates. Multiple systems compete before one settles into dominance. In early Sumerian texts, that struggle is absent. Word order is reliable. Grammatical markers are consistent. The relationship between sound, sign, and meaning appears already negotiated. Writing does not tame the language. It merely captures it. This raises an unavoidable question. How long was Sumerian spoken before it was written? Spoken languages can indeed develop complexity without writing, but they rarely do so without leaving footprints. They borrow words, they influence neighbours, they change in response to contact. Southern Mesopotamia was not isolated enough to prevent this. Trade routes crossed it. Populations moved through it. Cultural exchange was constant. Yet Sumerian resists clear borrowing in its earliest layers. It does not read like a hybrid language. It reads like a survivor, as if it belonged to a world whose other voices have fallen silent. Some linguists suggest that Sumerian's relatives simply vanished, that it once belonged to a broader family, now lost to time. This explanation is plausible, but it carries heavy implications. Languages do not disappear politely. Their speakers must be displaced, absorbed, or destroyed. Entire communities must vanish for linguistic families to leave no trace. Once again, the scale of loss implied mirrors the archaeological and mythological ruptures already observed. The internal structure of Sumerian supports this sense of deep time. Many of its words are built from layered concepts, as though meanings accumulated rather than emerged suddenly. The language feels stratified. Certain expressions seem fossilized, protected from change. Legal formulas, ritual phrases, royal titles appear early and remain remarkably stable. This is not the flexibility of innovation. It is the caution of preservation. The scribal culture reinforces this impression. Sumerian writing was taught through strict repetition. Students memorized lists of words, signs, and formulas. Accuracy mattered more than creativity. Variation was discouraged. This pedagogical approach is common when a culture fears loss. Language becomes something to guard, not to evolve. This fear becomes clearer when Akkadian rises to dominance. Sumerian gradually disappears from daily speech, yet it is not abandoned. Instead, it is preserved as a sacred and scholarly language. Priests, administrators, and scribes continue to study it long after it ceases to be spoken naturally. This choice is extraordinary. Most dead languages fade quietly. Sumerian is kept alive deliberately. That preservation suggests reverence, but also anxiety. To abandon Sumerian entirely would be to sever a connection to something foundational. Writing in Sumerian conferred legitimacy. It anchored authority in a past that could not otherwise speak. The language became a bridge across an invisible gap in memory. Mythology reflects this role. In Sumerian stories, language is not portrayed as a human invention. It is something given in earlier ages, shared with divine beings, powerful enough to shape reality. Names matter. Words carry weight. Speech itself feels ancient. Once again, the origin of something essential is pushed beyond human reach. Modern linguistics struggles here because its methods depend on continuity. When continuity breaks completely, explanation becomes cautious. Sumerian is labelled an isolate and studied in isolation. But isolation may not be the cause of its strangeness. It may be the result of everything around it having been erased. Languages are resilient. They can survive conquest, migration, and cultural change. But they cannot survive if their speakers vanish entirely. To leave no clear relatives, Sumerian must have passed through a bottleneck, a moment when only fragments endured. Enough to function, not enough to explain where they came from. This mirrors the broader Sumerian condition. Civilization appears already formed. Astronomy arrives already precise. Law exists without a recorded debate. Architecture rises without visible prototypes. Language joins this pattern. Each system behaves as if it remembers more than it can say. In this light, Sumerian is not mysterious because it is isolated. It is isolated because it survived something that others did not. It carries structure without story, form without origin. It speaks fluently, but it does not reminisce. There is a subtle emotional tone in the earliest text that supports this interpretation. They are practical, restrained, concerned with order and continuity. They do not celebrate beginnings. They do not marvel at invention. They focus on maintenance, on keeping things aligned, on ensuring that what exists continues to exist. This is not the voice of a culture discovering itself. It is the voice of one that has already experienced loss, a culture that understands how easily systems can vanish if not carefully preserved. Language becomes an anchor, pressed into clay to resist forgetting. The absence of linguistic ancestry does not prove a lost civilization, but it aligns with every other absence encountered so far. The buried cities, the flood narratives, the sudden completeness of systems. Each points toward interruption rather than emergence. What remains unresolved is how much was lost before Sumerian entered writing. Whether the language once carried stories of origins that no longer survived. Whether those stories dissolved along with the societies that spoke them. Or whether silence itself became a choice. When we read Sumerian today, we are not listening to the first human voice. We are listening to a voice that learned how to endure, a language that stabilized itself because instability had already taken too much. It speaks carefully, precisely, as if aware that memory is fragile and that once something is lost deeply enough, even words cannot bring it back. When the Sumerian silence begins to feel too heavy to ignore, it helps to look outward rather than backward. Not to search for direct proof, but to listen for echoes. Across the ancient world, in places separated by oceans and millennia, similar stories emerge. And what they share is not how civilization began, but how it resumed after something ended. In myth after myth, humanity does not awaken into the world. It survives it. The pattern repeats with unsettling consistency. A catastrophe arrives. Water, fire, darkness, or cold erases what existed before. A small remnant endures. Knowledge is preserved selectively. And when order returns, civilization reappears already shaped, already purposeful, already burdened with memory it cannot fully explain. These stories are often treated as metaphors or moral lessons, but their shared structure is difficult to dismiss. In Mesopotamia, the flood separates ages. In ancient India, cycles of yugas describe worlds repeatedly destroyed and renewed. In Mesoamerican traditions, earlier suns end in disaster before the current age begins. Even in Greek myth, humanity passes through declining ages, punctuated by divine resets. The beginning is never clean, it is always aftermath. What matters is not whether these myths describe the same event, but that they frame civilization the same way. Not as a first attempt, but as a continuation after loss. The gods do not teach humans how to invent from nothing. They instruct survivors on how to restore balance. Fire is remembered. Agriculture resumes. Social order returns. The tone is recovery, not discovery. This recurring structure suggests a shared psychological memory. Cultures that experience profound disruption tend to encode it symbolically. Over generations, specific details fade, but emotional truth persists. The world was once stable. Then it was not. Then it became stable again, but differently. Myths preserve this rhythm, even when history cannot. In many traditions, the survivors are chosen not for virtue, but for function. They are bearers of knowledge. They remember rituals, measurements, or laws. Their role is not to innovate, but to transmit. This mirrors the Sumerian emphasis on instruction rather than invention. Knowledge survives catastrophe because someone carries it across the boundary. Another striking similarity lies in what is missing. These myths rarely describe the civilization that existed before the catastrophe in detail. Its cities are unnamed. Its technologies are implied but not listed. Its language is assumed. This absence mirrors the archaeological and linguistic gaps already encountered. The past is acknowledged but not accessible. One explanation is that myths deliberately avoid specifics to remain adaptable. But another possibility is more unsettling, that the specifics were already gone by the time the story stabilized. Memory had thinned. What remained was structure without detail, pattern without content. Flood myths are particularly revealing. They appear in cultures with no obvious historical contact. The waters rise. The old world ends. A vessel preserves life. When the waters recede, humanity does not wander helplessly. It resumes agriculture, worship, and law. Civilization returns intact enough to function. This challenges the assumption that myths exaggerate primitive fear. Instead, they may encode long-term experiences of instability. Rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age reshaped coastlines globally. Entire regions that once supported human life disappeared beneath water. Communities were displaced. Knowledge fractured. Survival favoured memory over material accumulation. If so, then the sudden appearance of advanced systems in the archaeological record becomes less mysterious. What looks like spontaneous emergence may actually be reassembly. Skills refined in one context resurface in another. Complexity returns faster than it developed the first time. This does not require a single lost global civilization. It only requires repeated disruption. Enough collapse to erase continuity, but not enough to erase all knowledge. Over time, these interruptions would create the illusion of beginnings where there were only resumptions. The Sumerian case fits this pattern precisely. Their myths do not celebrate creation. They emphasize order restored. Their gods do not invent. They assign. Their heroes do not explore. They survive. Their history does not begin at zero, it begins after the reset. What is especially telling is how these myths treat time. It is not linear, it is cyclical. Ages rise and fall, worlds end and begin again. Progress is not guaranteed. memory becomes the most valuable resource because it is the hardest to preserve. Modern historical thinking resists this. We prefer straight lines. We want a single origin and a steady climb. Cycles feel regressive. They undermine the narrative of inevitable advancement. Yet myth after myth insists on recurrence, not as punishment, but as reality. This insistence may reflect lived experience rather than imagination. For early societies, stability was fragile. Climate shifts, volcanic eruptions, droughts, floods, and migrations could collapse entire ways of life. To survive such volatility, cultures learned to prioritize continuity of knowledge over celebration of novelty. Seen through this lens, the absence of beginnings in Sumerian records is not an anomaly. It is part of a broader human pattern. When the past is too damaged to reconstruct, cultures begin their histories where memory becomes reliable again. Everything before that is acknowledged only as loss. This reframes the question entirely. Instead of asking why Sumerian records never describe the beginning of civilization, we might ask why so many civilizations describe an ending instead. Why the world's oldest stories begin with destruction rather than creation. Perhaps because for much of human history, the defining experience was not emergence, but survival. Civilization did not arrive once and stay. It flickered. It retreated. It returned in altered forms. Each return carried fragments of what came before, but rarely the full story. If this is true, then Sumer is not unique. It is simply the earliest place where recovery left durable traces. Writing, architecture, law, and astronomy appear together not because they were invented together, but because they were preserved together. The myths from around the world do not prove this. They cannot, but they do something else. They make the silence less isolated. They suggest that what Sumer forgot, humanity forgot many times over. What remains unresolved is whether these stories point to specific historical events or to a general condition of fragility, whether they remember particular collapses or simply encode the knowledge that collapse is always possible. Either way, the pattern endures. Civilization begins again and again, not with celebration, but with caution. Not with invention, but with restoration. Not with confidence, but with memory held tightly enough to cross the next threshold. And so when Sumerian history opens without a beginning, it may not be incomplete. It may be honest. It may be beginning exactly where it could, after the last time the world ended, and just before it would one day do so again. If civilization truly resumes rather than begins, then the forces capable of interrupting it must be taken seriously, not as isolated disasters, but as recurring pressures built into the world itself. When we turn from myth and language to geology and climate, the picture grows less abstract and more uncomfortable. The earth beneath early civilizations was not stable. It was changing faster than memory could adapt. The end of the last ice age did not conclude quietly. Between roughly 12,000 and 7,000 years ago, global temperatures rose, ice sheets retreated, and sea levels climbed dramatically. Coastlines moved inland. River systems reorganized themselves. Entire landscapes that had supported human life for generations were submerged or transformed. This was not a single event, but a long sequence of disruptions, punctuated by sudden pulses of instability. For societies dependent on predictable seasons and waterways, this volatility would have been devastating. A river that nourished a city could change course within a lifetime. Fertile land could become marsh or desert. Settlements carefully placed for one climate could become uninhabitable under another. In such conditions, continuity would be fragile even without catastrophe. Mesopotamia was especially vulnerable. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers are dynamic, prone to flooding, avulsion, and sediment overload. Archaeological evidence shows repeated episodes where floodplains expanded rapidly, burying existing landscapes beneath layers of silt. These processes do not preserve history neatly, they erase it unevenly, leaving some areas intact while others vanish entirely. This uneven erasure creates a dangerous illusion. Survivors rebuild in places where stability returns first. Their cities endure. Their records survive. What lies beyond those islands of stability disappears from view. Later observers mistake visibility for primacy. The first civilization we can see is assumed to be the first that existed. Climate data complicates this assumption further. Ice core records and sediment analysis reveal abrupt cooling and warming events during the early Holocene. These shifts could disrupt agriculture, trigger migrations, and collapse regional networks of trade and knowledge. Even societies with advanced systems could fail under sustained environmental stress. Importantly, collapse does not require ignorance. Highly organized societies are often more vulnerable because their complexity depends on balance. When irrigation fails, when harvests fluctuate wildly, when populations are forced to move, institutions strain and fracture. Knowledge may survive in fragments, carried by people rather than buildings. This is how resets happen. Not as clean breaks, but as thinning. Some skills endure, others vanish. Social memory narrows. When conditions stabilize again, what returns is not the same civilization, but a compressed version of it. Enough to function, not enough to remember everything. This framework helps explain the peculiar completeness of early Sumerian systems. Writing, law, astronomy, and architecture appear together because they survived together. They were the most useful, the most portable, the most essential for restoring order. Other knowledge may have existed, but did not survive repeated disruption. Geology also challenges the idea that human occupation was confined to the regions we now study. Lower sea levels during glacial periods exposed vast coastal plains, now submerged. These areas would have been rich in resources and attractive to settlement. When sea levels rose, any societies living there would have been displaced or drowned, their material culture lost beneath the ocean. What remains on land is only part of the story. The archaeological record is biased towards survival, not significance. We study what endured, not what mattered most to the people who lived then. This bias shapes our timelines and hardens assumptions. From this perspective, the notion of a civilizational reset is not speculative fantasy. It is a plausible outcome of known natural processes acting over long periods. No singular apocalypse is required. Only instability sustained long enough to erode continuity. This also reframes flood myths. They need not describe one global event to reflect truth. They may encode cumulative experience. Repeated inundations, repeated losses. Over time, memory condenses complexity into symbol. The flood becomes the name for an era when the world could not be trusted to remain itself. If this is the case, then the Sumerian silence about beginnings is not evasive. It is adaptive. Origins belong to a world that no longer exists in recoverable form. To dwell on them would be to dwell on failure. Instead, attention turns to what can be maintained now. This attitude is visible in the tone of early records. They are practical, procedural, focused on management, grain counts, labour assignments, ritual calendars. Civilization is treated not as achievement but as responsibility, something that must be actively sustained against entropy. Modern narratives often assume that once complexity arises, it naturally persists. The geological record disagrees. Complexity can vanish quickly under the right conditions. What returns afterward may look sudden, only because the struggle to survive left few traces. This makes the idea of a first civilization increasingly fragile. What we call first may simply be the earliest instance that survived in visible form. Earlier attempts may lie beyond our reach, erased by rising waters, buried by sediment, or scattered by migration. None of this proves the existence of a lost, advanced civilization. It does not need to. It establishes something more modest and more troubling. That the conditions necessary for continuity are rare. That history is shaped as much by erasure as by creation. That what we know is a subset of what once was. The geological record does not speak in stories. It speaks in layers, gaps, and distortions. When read carefully, it does not confirm a clean ascent from simplicity to complexity. It reveals turbulence, fits and starts, long periods where human effort left little that could endure. In such a world, the emergence of Sumer looks less like a miracle and more like a moment of reprieve. A pause in instability long enough for memory to harden into clay. A window where civilization could write itself down before the ground shifted again. What remains unresolved is how many such windows existed before, how many times knowledge was gathered, refined and then scattered. how often humanity stood at the edge of continuity and failed to cross it. The Sumerians do not answer these questions. They do not speculate about deep prehistory. They work with what they have, perhaps because they understood something we often forget, that the earth does not owe us permanence, that civilization survives not by inevitability, but by vigilance. And beneath their cities, beneath their records, beneath even their myths, the planet continues its slow, indifferent motion, reshaping coastlines, redirecting rivers, reminding every civilization that stability is temporary, and that what we call beginnings may simply be the moments when survival finally left a trace. When a civilization leaves no account of its own beginning, the silence itself becomes a clue, not an empty space, but a shaped one. In summer, history does not drift into writing accidentally. It enters through doors guarded by institutions whose survival depended on stability. Memory was not free to wander. It was trained, narrowed, and anchored to power. The earliest written texts from Mesopotamia do not resemble chronicles or reflections. They are practical to the point of austerity. Lists of goods, measures of grain, records of labour, calendars of offerings. Writing emerges as a technology of control, not curiosity. It exists to regulate the present, not to explore the past. This initial function matters more than it appears to. When writing serves administration, it favours repeatability over explanation. It records what must be done again tomorrow, not how things once came to be. Origins offer no immediate utility. Procedures do. Obligations do. Authority does. The first written memory of civilization begins where order is already assumed. Temples stood at the centre of this system. They were not only religious spaces, but economic engines and archival cores. Within them, knowledge was stored, copied, and authorised. What entered the archive gained legitimacy. What remained outside it gradually dissolved. This is not censorship in the modern sense. It is structural selection. The gods themselves reflect this logic. In Sumerian texts, they do not argue over first principles. They assign roles. They allocate domains. They enforce boundaries. Law, kingship, and cosmic order are not presented as human achievements, but as eternal conditions. By placing the foundations of society beyond human time, the question of beginnings becomes irrelevant. Kingship offers the clearest example. The Sumerian king list does not explain how leadership arose. It declares that kingship descended from heaven. That single statement removes political authority from history and places it in mythic permanence. Kings do not emerge, they arrive. And once arrived, they continue. This framing is powerful because it closes doors. If authority has no origin, it cannot be revised. If order has always existed, it does not need justification. After periods of instability, such certainty is invaluable. It calms fear. It discourages experimentation. It protects fragile cohesion. Scribal education reinforces this approach. Training emphasized copying canonical texts exactly as they were received. Students memorized approved lists, formulas, and phrases. Variation was error. Precision was virtue. The role of the scribe was not to ask why, but to ensure that what already existed did not change. In such a system, forgetting does not require intent. It happens naturally. Knowledge that does not serve the present is not copied. What is not copied disappears. Over generations, absence hardens into silence. Silence becomes tradition. Flood narratives reveal the same pattern. They acknowledge catastrophe, but only within a framework that preserves authority. The gods choose who survives. Knowledge passes through obedience. After destruction, the same cosmic hierarchy resumes. The past beyond the flood is not examined. It is compressed into a single rupture that justifies the present order. What is striking is how little curiosity these texts show about the world before that rupture. No interest in alternative social arrangements. No reflection on what was lost. The disaster exists to validate continuity, not to invite comparison. The past is allowed to exist only as a warning, never as a model. This selective memory is not unique to Sumer. It appears wherever institutions seek permanence. Egyptian rulers trace legitimacy to divine ancestry. Chinese dynasties invoked heaven's mandate. Medieval authority grounded itself in sacred tradition. In each case, origins receded into myth because they threatened inevitability. The difference with Sumer is temporal proximity. We are close enough to see the mechanism forming. Writing emerges at the same moment, authority consolidates. History begins where questioning ends. Everything before is absorbed into a timeless realm beyond investigation. Modern readers often assume that if earlier knowledge existed, it would have been written down. But writing is not neutral. It follows power. It serves structure. Knowledge that destabilizes authority has little incentive to enter the archive, especially in societies rebuilding after collapse. If fragments of deeper memory survived, oral traditions, restricted teaching, symbolic rituals, they may never have been formalized. To formalize them would be to acknowledge that the present order was not the first, not the only, not inevitable. That acknowledgement would weaken the very systems writing was designed to protect. The tone of early Sumerian texts reflects this restraint. They are procedural, restrained, focused on maintenance. Civilization is not celebrated as a triumph. It is treated as a responsibility, something that must be continually upheld against forces that have already proven capable of undoing it. From this perspective, the absence of beginnings is not a failure of record keeping. It is a boundary, a line drawn to protect order from a destabilizing memory. The past exists only insofar as it supports the present. This boundary shapes everything that follows. Later civilizations inherit a record that already begins midstream. Modern historians encounter the silence and mistake it for emptiness. The question of origins fades, not because it was answered, but because it was never allowed to be asked. Yet the silence remains active. It presses against the edges of the record. It appears in sudden completeness, in systems without developmental trails, in myths that speak of endings rather than starts. It suggests that history is not only written by survivors, but trimmed by necessity. What remains unresolved is how conscious this trimming was, whether scribes felt they were omitting anything at all, or whether the world before simply lay beyond the limits of what could be integrated into a functioning society. Perhaps after catastrophe, there is little appetite for deep reflection. Survival demands focus. Stability demands certainty. Memory becomes selective, not out of malice, but out of care. If so, then the Sumerian silence is not deceptive. It is protective. A way of holding civilization together by narrowing its story. A way of ensuring that what survived could continue without being undermined by what could no longer be recovered. In that light, the missing beginning is not an absence at all. It is a decision made quietly at the moment when order finally returned, and no one wanted to risk losing it again. As the written record of Sumer grows denser, another absence begins to assert itself, one that is harder to dismiss as myth or geology. The texts themselves speak of other texts. References appear to tablets, lists, hymns, and instructions that no longer exist. Knowledge is cited, attributed, and assumed, yet the sources are missing. Civilization speaks with footnotes that lead nowhere. In administrative records, scribes occasionally mention earlier decrees or precedents without copying them. Legal formulas imply long-standing traditions that are never fully reproduced. Hymns allude to stories already known to the audience, stories whose full versions are absent from surviving collections. The record feels abridged, as if we are reading an edited edition of a much larger archive. This is not unusual in itself. No ancient archive survives intact, but the scale of implication matters. Sumerian literature does not behave like a young tradition gradually expanding. It behaves like a condensed one, preserving fragments of something broader. The silences are not random. They cluster around origins, foundations, and deep time. Even the act of writing suggests loss. Early scribes often copied lists of signs, words, and phrases whose meanings were no longer transparent. Some signs appear in lexical lists long after their original context had vanished. Students memorize forms without fully understanding their origin. This is the behavior of a culture maintaining inheritance, not inventing from scratch. There are also references to temples, cities, and rituals that archaeology cannot confirm. Names appear without locations. Practices are mentioned without explanation. The assumption is familiarity. The text expects the reader to know what is being referenced. That expectation points to a shared cultural memory that extended beyond what was written down. The most intriguing absences appear in mythological texts. Creation stories begin mid-process. Flood narratives skip details. The gods refer to decisions made earlier, in councils whose deliberations are never recorded. Outcomes are preserved. Debates are not. Once again, function survives, process disappears. One explanation is practicality. Clay tablets are fragile. Archives burn, flood, and crumble. Much was undoubtedly lost by chance, but chance alone does not explain pattern. The missing material consistently relates to beginnings, transitions, and prior frameworks. It is as if the record preserves results while allowing origins to dissolve. The structure of Sumerian libraries reinforces this idea. Tablets were copied selectively. Scribes chose what to reproduce based on relevance. Administrative documents were temporary. Ritual texts were preserved. Legal formulas endured. Speculative or narrative material was less likely to survive unless it served a clear function. Over time, this filtering reshaped memory. This process is visible even within surviving collections. Some texts exist in multiple versions with gaps between them. Others appear as summaries or excerpts. Rarely do we find exhaustive accounts. Compression seems deliberate, or at least accepted. Knowledge is distilled until only what is necessary remains. The absence of certain categories of text is particularly striking. There are no Sumerian treatises on the origins of writing, the development of law, or the first establishment of cities. These topics, so central to modern historical curiosity, appear to have been unimportant to preserve. Either they were never written, or they were not considered worth copying. If earlier civilizations existed, as the patterns suggest, then their records may never have crossed the threshold into the Sumerian archive. Not because they were unknown, but because they were incompatible. Integrating them would complicate the narrative of continuity. It would introduce alternative paths into a system built on stability. There is also the possibility of deliberate forgetting. Not erasure through destruction, but through neglect. Knowledge that cannot be reconciled with the present order becomes awkward. It circulates orally for a time, then fades. What remains are references without context, echoes without sources. Later Mesopotamian cultures inherited this fragmented archive. Akkadian scribes preserved Sumerian texts they considered authoritative. Even when they no longer fully understood them, the act of preservation became ritualized. Meaning was less important than continuity. This further obscured origins. Modern archaeology encounters the result of this long filtering process. We recover tablets that were already curated by ancient standards. We see what survived copying, not what was first written. The archive we study is not the whole record, but the residue of many decisions made over centuries. This complicates the idea of missing evidence. What is missing may never have been meant to last, or it may have been intentionally allowed to fade. In societies shaped by disruption, remembering everything is a liability. Selective memory becomes adaptive. The Sumerians themselves hint at this fragility. Their texts often emphasize preservation. Knowledge must be written, sealed, witnessed. The anxiety is palpable. Writing is treated not as convenience, but as defense against forgetting. That urgency suggests prior loss. When we read references to vanished texts, we are not just encountering gaps in archaeology. We are encountering the edges of a memory system designed to survive catastrophe by narrowing itself. The archive becomes lean, functional, and incomplete by design. What remains unresolved is how much was lost before writing began, and how much was lost after. Whether the missing texts once contained stories of earlier worlds, or explanations that no longer fit the rebuilt order. Whether those stories were ever written at all. The silence does not answer these questions, but the pattern persists. Civilization speaks as if it remembers more than it records, as if it inherited knowledge it no longer knows how to explain. The missing tablets, the cited but absent works, the implied traditions without surviving texts, all point to a past that was once richer, more complex and less stable than the record suggests. A past that did not vanish cleanly, but was trimmed away until only what could endure remained. In the end, the Sumerian archive feels less like a beginning and more like a survival kit, a carefully assembled collection of what mattered most after something had already gone wrong. And in the margins of that collection, in the references that lead nowhere, the lost chapters of civilization continue to press quietly against the limits of what we are allowed to know. As civilization moved beyond Sumer, something essential travelled with it, and something essential did not. The systems endured. The memory of how those systems came to be did not. Later societies inherited functioning frameworks without inheriting their beginnings, and over time, this imbalance became normal. What survived was usefulness. What vanished was explanation. When Akkadian-speaking peoples rose to prominence, they did not replace Sumerian civilization so much as step into it. The writing system remained. Administrative logic persisted. Legal thinking followed familiar patterns. Yet the relationship to this inheritance subtly shifted. Sumerian ceased to be a spoken language of daily life and became a preserved one, maintained through education, ritual, and tradition rather than lived experience. This transformation is revealing. A language kept alive through copying rather than conversation becomes static. It stops evolving naturally. It accumulates authority because it no longer adapts. Sumerian texts were preserved precisely because they were ancient, not because they were fully understood. Over generations, reverence replaced fluency. Akkadian scribes compiled bilingual lists, pairing Sumerian signs with Akkadian meanings. This act was practical, but it also marked a loss. Translation keeps systems operational, but it rarely preserves context. The deeper assumptions behind concepts, why a law took a certain form, why a ritual mattered, fade even as the form survives. This pattern extended far beyond language. Legal structures continued to function long after their original social conditions had changed. Ritual calendars were followed even when their cosmological logic was no longer fully grasped. Architectural forms were repeated because they signaled legitimacy, not because their original symbolic meanings were intact. Civilization advanced through repetition rather than reinvention. By the time Babylon emerged, Sumer was already distant, almost mythic. Yet Babylonian scholars continued to copy Sumerian hymns, myths, and legal precedents with meticulous care. This was not antiquarian curiosity, it was an assertion of continuity. To preserve Sumerian knowledge was to claim inheritance. To inherit was to legitimize power. In this environment, questioning origins offered little benefit. The systems worked. They produced order. They supported authority. Curiosity about how they first emerged could only complicate that stability. Over time, the absence of beginnings ceased to feel strange. It became expected. Mythology adapted accordingly. Babylonian creation stories reshaped older Sumerian themes without altering their structure. The flood still separated ages. Knowledge still descended from higher realms. Civilization still resumed after catastrophe, rather than emerging gradually. The narrative changed names and details, but its core logic remained intact. As generations passed, distance from the original rupture increased. Memory compressed. What had once been lived experience of instability became allegory. Floods became symbols. Loss became story. Survival hardened into destiny. The original reason for caution faded, but the caution itself remained embedded in tradition. This process was not unique to Mesopotamia. Egyptian civilization inherited architectural and ritual systems whose origins lay beyond its earliest dynasties. Greek thinkers inherited astronomical and mathematical knowledge from older cultures, without clear records of its development. Roman law absorbed centuries of precedent, while rarely revisiting its earliest foundations. In each case, civilization advanced by trusting what functioned. Inheritance replaced investigation. Systems became self-justifying. Their effectiveness stood in for explanation. Over time, usefulness became proof of inevitability. This inheritance model helps explain why early civilizations often appear suddenly sophisticated. They are not inventing from nothing. They are stabilizing what survived. The long process of development occurred earlier, under conditions that did not preserve material evidence well. What we see is not birth, but consolidation. Modern historical thinking struggles with this idea because it disrupts linear narratives. We expect progress to leave visible trails. When it does not, we label it miraculous or anomalous. Yet survival rarely leaves neat records. It leaves fragments, carried forward selectively. The Sumerian legacy illustrates this clearly. Knowledge crossed a boundary, environmental, social, or both. beyond which it could not carry its full story. What passed through was compressed. Essentials were kept. Explanations were shed. Origins became too fragile to preserve. Later civilizations inherited this compressed state as normal. They did not experience it as loss. They experienced it as tradition. The silence at the beginning hardened into an invisible assumption. History starts where writing starts. This assumption shapes how humanity understands itself. When the earliest visible civilizations appear already complex, we assume complexity arose suddenly. We forget that visibility depends on preservation, not primacy. We mistake endurance for origin. There is also a hidden risk in this process. Systems preserved without understanding become brittle. They function well under familiar conditions, but adapt poorly to change. When disruption returns, as it inevitably does, the deeper knowledge required to respond may no longer exist. This may explain why civilizations repeat patterns of collapse. Each stands on foundations it did not build and cannot fully see. When those foundations shift, shock replaces recognition. The lesson has already been forgotten, even if the structure remains. The Sumerians themselves may have sensed this danger. Their emphasis on repetition, preservation, and ritual suggests an awareness of fragility. Civilization to them was not guaranteed. It had to be held together deliberately. Later societies inherited the systems, but not always the caution. What remains unresolved is whether this inheritance was purely accidental or partially guided, whether certain forms were preserved deliberately to shape the future, or whether loss alone determined what endured. The surviving record cannot decide this. What it does reveal is a consistent pattern. Civilization does not transmit its entire memory forward. It transmits what it can carry. Over time, that cargo becomes lighter, more symbolic, and more authoritative. By the time we encounter later civilizations, the beginning has already receded beyond recovery. What remains is order without origin, structure without explanation, confidence without context. And beneath that confidence lies a quiet paradox. Humanity moves forward using tools forged long ago, convinced they are new, unaware that they are the survivors of a past that could not be fully remembered, and of a world that may have already ended once before. When modern scholars confront the Sumerian record, they do so carrying an expectation that history should behave politely. Causes should precede effects. Simplicity should lead to complexity. Beginnings should leave footprints. When those expectations are met, interpretation feels secure. When they are not, discomfort enters quietly and lingers. Sumer produces that discomfort almost immediately. Its earliest layers do not look experimental. Its writing does not stutter. Its institutions do not wobble into place. Instead, everything appears already aligned, as though the preliminary phases happened elsewhere or elsewhen. Faced with this, modern archaeology often responds by smoothing the problem rather than confronting it. Time is compressed. Development is assumed to be rapid rather than absent. Missing layers are attributed to erosion. Linguistic isolation becomes coincidence. Each explanation is reasonable in isolation. Together they function as insulation, protecting a linear narrative from disruption. This response is not born of negligence. Archaeology is a discipline shaped by caution. It privileges what can be demonstrated materially. When evidence is missing, the safest move is to avoid speculation. Yet safety has a cost. When absence appears repeatedly, consistently, and across multiple domains, refusing to engage with it becomes its own assumption. The deeper issue is philosophical. Modern historical thinking's anchored in continuity. Even collapse is framed as interruption within an overall ascent. The idea that civilization might repeatedly reset, losing memory while retaining fragments of skill, challenges the anchor. It suggests vulnerability rather than inevitability. It suggests that what we see may not be the first time something worked. Within academic frameworks, such ideas struggle to find a home. They do not fit neatly into timelines. They resist periodization. They cannot be resolved by a single discovery. As a result, they are often treated as fringe, even when the underlying observations are mainstream. This discomfort shapes terminology. Early Sumer is described as an emergence rather than a reappearance. Complexity is labelled sudden rather than inherited. The language maintains the impression of continuity even when the evidence is discontinuous. Words soften what the data complicates. There are also practical pressures. Research funding favours questions with definable outcomes. Museums favour narratives. Visitors can follow without unease. Textbooks favour clean origins. A civilization that appears without a beginning disrupts all three. It resists summarization. As a result, anomalies are compartmentalized. Flood layers belong to geology. Myths belong to religion. Writing belongs to linguistics. Architecture belongs to art history. Each field examines its fragment carefully, often without integrating it into a larger pattern. The connections remain implicit, rarely addressed head-on. Yet it is precisely the alignment of these anomalies that makes Sumer unsettling. The language is isolated. The astronomy is advanced. The cities rest on breaks. The myths emphasize endings rather than origins. The archive references lost knowledge. Each point alone invites explanation. Together, they suggest something more systemic. Accepting this would require archaeology to tolerate uncertainty in a new way, not as a temporary gap to be filled by future discovery, but as a feature of the past itself. Some losses may be irrecoverable. Some absences may reflect destruction rather than ignorance. Some beginnings may be thresholds rather than sources. This challenges the comfort of the term prehistory. The boundary between prehistory and history is often treated as a line where clarity begins. Writing appears, and uncertainty recedes. But Sumer complicates this. Writing appears, and uncertainty remains. The beginning of history is already incomplete. There is also an emotional resistance at work. The idea of repeated civilizational loss undermines the reassuring notion that progress accumulates safely. It implies that much may have already been forgotten, that humanity's past is thinner than we assume, that our confidence may rest on survival bias rather than comprehensive memory. Because of this, ideas that hint at lost civilizations are often dismissed wholesale, not because every version is flawed, but because the category itself feels destabilizing. It blurs the line between evidence and speculation. It threatens to open doors that cannot easily be closed. Yet dismissal carries its own risk. It assumes that absence always equals non-existence. It assumes that continuity is the default state of human history. The Sumerian record quietly undermines both assumptions, not through sensational claims, but through persistent silence. Archaeology is slowly expanding its reach. Remote sensing reveals buried landscapes. Underwater exploration opens drowned coastlines. Climate science reframes habitable zones. With each advance, the visible record shrinks relative to what may have existed. The more we learn, the clearer it becomes that survival determines visibility. Interpretation, however, changes more slowly than discovery. It is easier to add new data to existing models than to revise the models themselves. Sumer remains labelled the first civilization, because the phrase is familiar, not because it resolves the underlying questions. This creates a quiet paradox. The discipline that uncovers the strongest evidence for disruption often works hardest to neutralize its implications. Gaps are explained away, silences are normalized, the narrative holds, but it holds under strain. What if that strain is meaningful? What if Sumer is not meant to fit comfortably into our expectations? What if its refusal to explain itself is the most honest thing about it? The Sumerians themselves did not claim to stand at the beginning. They did not describe invention. They recorded administration. They preserved function. They treated civilization as something to be maintained, not celebrated. In doing so, they may have been closer to the truth than later interpreters. Modern archaeology mirrors this tension. It values stability. It protects coherence. It avoids opening questions that cannot be answered definitively. But history is not obligated to be definitive. It is obligated only to reflect what remains. Accepting discontinuity does not mean abandoning rigor. It means expanding humility. It means allowing for the possibility that some chapters are gone for good. That what we call beginnings may simply be the earliest moments that survived intact. The discomfort does not resolve here. It persists, hovering at the edge of interpretation. But perhaps that persistence is itself instructive. It marks the place where evidence stops cooperating with expectation, and in that friction, history may be offering its most honest lesson. Not that we know where civilization began, but that we should be careful about assuming it began only once. If the evidence has been quietly pointing anywhere, it is toward a possibility that feels less like a revelation than a reorientation. That civilization may not be a single ascent from ignorance to mastery, but a series of recoveries. That what we call the first civilization may be the first one that survived visibly, not the first one that existed. This idea does not require lost continents or fantastical technologies. It requires only repetition. Repeated instability, repeated collapse, repeated rebuilding under conditions that favoured memory over material. Over long spans of time, such repetition would thin the record until only the most resilient forms remained. Writing appears late not because humans were incapable before, but because permanence was rare. Seen through this lens, Sumer becomes a threshold rather than an origin, a moment when the world stabilised long enough for knowledge to be externalised. Clay hardened, cities endured, archives survived. What crossed into this stable window did so already shaped by experience, already refined by necessity. The idea of prior civilizations often provokes resistance because it is imagined as an all-or-nothing claim. Either there was a global advanced society, or there was nothing. But history rarely works in absolutes. More likely are regional cultures achieving complexity, then losing it under pressure. Knowledge fragments carried forward unevenly. Skills remembered without context. Systems reconstructed from partial memory. This would produce exactly what we see. Sudden sophistication without visible development. Isolated languages without ancestors. Myths of catastrophe without detail. Advanced astronomy without recorded trial and error. Civilization that behaves like it remembers something it can no longer articulate. Even the Sumerian gods fit this pattern. They do not invent. They assign. They maintain. They enforce order that already exists. They are custodians, not creators. Their authority lies in age rather than novelty. They embody continuity across rupture. What makes this interpretation compelling is not any single piece of evidence, but convergence. Archaeology shows interruption. Mythology remembers catastrophe. Linguistics reveals isolation. Astronomy implies inheritance. Archives reference missing sources. Institutions suppress origins. Each strand alone can be explained away. Together they suggest a deeper pattern. That pattern does not insist on a single lost golden age. It suggests something quieter and more human. That civilization has been attempted more than once. That complexity can arise, be lost, and arise again without starting from zero. That humanity's past may be longer, more fragile, and more cyclical than linear timelines allow. This possibility changes how we interpret beginnings. The first appearance of writing becomes not the first thought, but the first durable record. The first city becomes not the first settlement, but the first one not erased. The first law becomes not the first agreement, but the first one that survived copying. In this view, the question is not why Sumerian records never describe the beginning of civilization. It is whether any civilization that survives long enough to write would ever describe its own true beginning. That beginning may belong to a world already lost by the time stability returns. There is also a psychological dimension. After catastrophe, societies rarely celebrate the past. They narrow their focus. They prioritize function. They avoid questions that reopen trauma. Memory becomes selective. Origins blur. What matters is what works now. The Sumerians seem to reflect this mindset. Their texts are procedural. Their tone is restrained. They do not speculate about deep time. They do not glorify invention. They preserve. They maintain. They proceed carefully, as if aware that order is temporary. Modern discomfort with this idea may reflect our own assumptions rather than ancient reality. We live in a world where continuity feels normal. We expect knowledge to accumulate. We expect progress to be durable. The idea that entire chapters could vanish challenges that expectation. Yet the planet does not guarantee continuity. Climate shifts. Sea levels rise. Rivers change course. Earthquakes and droughts reshape habitability. Over thousands of years, these forces do not merely inconvenience societies. They erase them. Against this background, it would be surprising if civilization had only been attempted once. It would be surprising if knowledge had never been lost deeply enough to leave no trace. It would be surprising if Sumer were truly the beginning rather than the first surviving chapter. What remains unresolved is how many such chapters existed, how many times complexity arose and disappeared, how much knowledge thinned before crossing into visible history. These questions may never be answered definitively, but the absence of answers does not invalidate the question. It sharpens it. It reminds us that history is shaped by survival bias. What we see is not all that happened. It is what endured. Sumer stands at the edge of that endurance, not as a triumphant beginning, but as a quiet resumption. Civilization continuing without explaining how it once already knew what it knew. This interpretation does not diminish Sumerian achievement. It deepens it. It frames their accomplishment not as spontaneous brilliance, but as careful reconstruction, as the preservation of order after loss, as memory stabilized into form. And perhaps this is the most honest way to understand early civilization. Not as the moment humanity awakened, but as the moment humanity remembered enough to begin again. The silence at the beginning remains, but it no longer feels empty. It feels occupied by something we can sense but not recover, a past that shaped what followed without leaving a clear outline. The question then shifts, quietly but decisively. Not where civilization began, but how many times it had to begin again before one beginning finally lasted long enough to be written down. If civilization has risen more than once, then forgetting is not a failure of intelligence. It is a condition of survival. What is lost is not always what mattered least, but what could not be carried across disruption. The cost of forgetting, however, is paid later, when societies mistake inheritance for invention and certainty for permanence. When origins vanish, systems harden. Laws become unquestionable. Rituals persist without explanation. Authority feels ancient even when it is recent. This can stabilize a society in the short term, but it also narrows imagination. Without memory of earlier collapses, warning signs lose their meaning. Instability feels unprecedented when it is not. The Sumerian record hints at this tension quietly. Their emphasis on preservation suggests awareness of fragility. Their restraint suggests caution. Yet even they could not preserve everything. What crossed into writing was already filtered. What followed inherited not only systems, but also their blind spots. Later civilizations paid the price. They inherited order without inheriting the conditions that made order possible. Irrigation systems were maintained without remembering why they failed before. Calendars were trusted without remembering how climate could break them. Political authority was sanctified without remembering how quickly it could dissolve. Forgetting creates confidence. Confidence accelerates growth. Growth amplifies vulnerability. When disruption returns, it does so in a world that no longer recognizes its own patterns. This cycle appears again and again. The Bronze Age collapses across the Mediterranean. Complex trade networks vanish. Writing systems disappear. Cities are abandoned. Knowledge fragments survive, but the connective tissue is gone. When civilization re-emerges, it does so unevenly, carrying echoes without context. The same pattern repeats in later eras. Rome inherits centuries of law and engineering, but not the social conditions that sustained them. Medieval Europe preserves classical texts without fully understanding their foundations. Each recovery feels like progress, but each is also a narrowing. The danger is not ignorance, it is partial memory. Knowing how to use systems without knowing why they fail creates an illusion of mastery. Societies become efficient at repeating success and blind to repetition of collapse. If Sumer represents a recovery after loss, then its silence about beginnings may reflect an understanding later civilizations lacked. That remembering too much can destabilize, but remembering too little invites repetition. Balance is difficult. The Sumerians leaned toward caution. Their descendants leaned toward confidence. This raises an unsettling question. What knowledge was lost because it was too painful, too destabilizing, or too incompatible with survival? Knowledge of past failures. Knowledge of environmental limits. Knowledge of social thresholds beyond which complexity becomes brittle. Such knowledge is rarely celebrated. It does not build monuments. It does not legitimize authority. It warns rather than empowers. In times of rebuilding, Warnings are often ignored. The absence of beginnings in the Sumerian record may therefore represent a trade-off. Stability gained at the cost of deep memory. Order secured at the expense of historical self-awareness. The price of survival paid forward. Modern civilization faces a similar dilemma. We inherit systems built over centuries. We understand how to operate them, but not always how they break. Climate patterns shift. Ecological balances strain. Institutions respond procedurally, often without historical depth. The difference is scale. The world is now interconnected. Disruption propagates faster. Recovery windows may be narrower. Forgetting carries higher stakes. The Sumerian silence becomes instructive here. It reminds us that what is not recorded can shape the future as much as what is. That civilizations do not only collapse because they lack technology, but because they lack memory of fragility. This does not mean that all forgetting is avoidable. Some loss is inevitable. Catastrophe erases context. Survival prioritizes function. But awareness of this process can temper certainty. It can encourage humility. Perhaps the most dangerous belief is that civilization has only begun once, that it is new, that it is immune to patterns that shaped those before. This belief is comforting, but it is unsupported by the record we do have. If civilization has restarted before, it can restart again. If knowledge has thinned before, it can thin again. The lesson is not despair, it is attention. The Sumerians wrote carefully. They counted precisely. They aligned their cities with the sky. They treated order as something to be held, not assumed. Their restraint may reflect an intuition that later generations lost. As memory fades, confidence grows. As confidence grows, risk accumulates. When the cycle turns, the past appears suddenly relevant again. But by then it may be inaccessible. The cost of forgetting is not immediate, it is delayed. It arrives when conditions change and inherited systems no longer respond. At that moment, the absence of origins becomes a practical problem. Without knowledge of how systems came to be, adaptation becomes guesswork. This may explain why civilizations often reach backward during crisis, searching for lost wisdom. They mythologize ancestors. They revive ancient practices. They sense that something essential has slipped beyond reach. The Sumerians may have stood closer to that slipping edge than we do. Their silence feels less like ignorance and more like respect, a recognition that some knowledge had already been lost, and that survival required moving forward anyway. What remains unresolved is whether we can do better, whether modern civilization can preserve not just systems, but memory of their limits, whether we can carry forward not only how to build, but how to fail safely. The past does not offer guarantees, it offers patterns. Sumer's silence is one such pattern. It suggests that civilization can endure without origins, but not without vigilance. As the record approaches its end, the question becomes less historical and more philosophical. Not why the beginning is missing, but what we choose to remember now, while we still can. Because forgetting is not just something that happens after collapse. It begins long before, quietly, in moments of confidence, when survival feels secure enough that caution seems unnecessary, and that is when silence starts to form again. At the end of this long trail of silences, the question no longer feels historical. It feels human. If civilization does not remember its own beginning, perhaps that is because beginnings are not where meaning settles. Meaning accumulates later, after loss, after interruption, after survival narrows what can be carried forward. Sumer stands not at the dawn of time, but at a clearing. Behind it lies terrain too damaged to map. Ahead of it lies history, as we recognize it. Writing begins not when humanity first thinks, but when thinking can finally be stabilized long enough to leave a mark. The absence of origins, then, is not an error in the record. It is the condition that made the record possible. Seen this way, the Sumerian silence becomes less mysterious and more revealing. Civilization does not announce itself at birth. It emerges quietly, already cautious, already aware of how easily it can be undone. It records procedures instead of dreams, measurements instead of myths, calendars instead of memories. What it preserves is not the story of how it began, but the instructions for how to continue. This reframes the meaning of first. The first city is the first that remained. The first law is the first that survived copying. The first writing is the first that endured beyond decay. Everything earlier may have existed just as fully, but briefly, in forms that could not outlast upheaval. In this sense, history is not a complete archive of the past. It is a residue, a thin layer of what endured when most things did not. What we call origins may simply be the earliest surviving footprints on ground that has been walked many times before. The Sumerians may have understood this intuitively. Their texts do not celebrate novelty. They assume fragility. They treat order as something that must be renewed daily. Civilization to them was not destiny. It was maintenance. This attitude contrasts sharply with later confidence. As writing spreads, as empires grow, as continuity extends, certainty replaces caution. The memory of loss fades. The silence at the beginning becomes invisible. History appears to flow smoothly forward, and the idea of reset begins to feel implausible. Yet the patterns persist. Collapse returns. Knowledge thins. Recovery follows. Each time the new world believes itself unprecedented. Each time it inherits more than it knows. If there is a warning embedded in the Sumerian record, it is not apocalyptic. It is quiet. It suggests that civilization is not a single achievement, but a repeated effort. That survival selects for function, not for memory. That what endures may not include the lessons that mattered most. This does not diminish human capacity. It highlights resilience, the ability to rebuild without knowing everything that was lost, to stabilize order with partial knowledge, to continue without full understanding. These are not failures, they are adaptations. But adaptation carries risk. When memory thins too much, patterns repeat blindly. Systems are trusted beyond their limits. Environmental signals are misread. Social structures harden. Collapse, when it comes, feels inexplicable because its precursors were forgotten. The Sumerian silence invites us to sit with this discomfort rather than resolve it. To accept that some chapters of the human story may be gone permanently. That archaeology, language, and myth can only gesture toward them. That certainty is not the natural state of history. What remains then is not an answer, but a posture, a way of holding the past that allows for absence, a recognition that what we know is shaped by survival bias, not completeness. That beginnings may be thresholds rather than sources. The ground beneath the earliest cities does not speak clearly. The texts do not look backward. The myths point to endings, not starts. Together they form a quiet consensus. Civilization begins where memory becomes possible again. Perhaps this is why the question of origins never settles. Each time we approach it, the evidence recedes. The silence holds, not because nothing happened, but because what happened could not be carried through. In that silence there is neither triumph nor loss alone. There is continuity without explanation, order without origin, a fragile thread stretched across unknown spans of time. And maybe that is the most honest inheritance of all. Not a story of how everything began, but an awareness that it has ended before, that it could end again, and that what matters most is not knowing the first step, but recognizing how carefully the next one must be placed. The Sumerians did not tell us where civilization began. They showed us what it looks like after remembering just enough to continue. The rest remains buried, not as a secret to be uncovered, but as a reminder that history is shaped as much by what could not survive as by what did. The silence remains, not empty, not accidental, simply waiting, like ground beneath a city, holding the weight of everything that came after it.